Okay, so, as a philosopher, you've probably spent a lot of time like thinking about how to define, big concepts like good or justice, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, what if we take that same kind of philosophical thinking and apply it to the world of business?
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so in this deep dive, we're going to be looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on business ethics
Okay.
and kind of like dissecting, all the ethical stuff that comes up when we talk about exchanges and the players involved.
I think it's really cool for like a philosophical mind like yours
Yeah,
is that the questions we grapple with in business ethics, they're not, some new thing.
right.
If you go all the way back to like the Code of Hammurabi, like almost 4,000 years ago,
Wow.
you could see that people were already concerned about fair dealing and ethical behavior in trade.
That's true.
So even though the formal field of business ethics is relatively new, the underlying philosophical questions are super old.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we're not trying to treat business ethics as like, less rigorous or anything.
Right.
It's a real area of applied ethics with these deep philosophical roots.
Absolutely.
And for you, listening, we're really going to hone in on the normative questions.
Okay.
Like what is ethical and what's unethical in business. We're not going to get into all the social science stuff,
Yeah.
like does being ethical actually make you more money? Or why do people act unethically? We're going to stick to the philosophy.
I think that's really the core of it, right? Like, what are the moral obligations of people and organizations when they're doing business? What principles should guide them when they're exchanging goods and services?
Exactly. So in this deep dive, we're going to tackle a few key areas. We'll start by looking at, what does it even mean for business to be about exchange? Like, what are the ethical implications baked into that?
Right.
Then we'll get into a really tricky question. Can a corporation actually be a moral agent? Like a who that can be held responsible?
Hmm. That's a tough one.
Or is it just a what? Kind of like how we talk about collective responsibility.
Yeah.
Like we say things like Google innovates or ExxonMobil caused that oil spill.
Right. We assign agency to these companies.
Yeah, exactly. But as a philosopher, I bet you can see the problem there.
Oh, for sure. Corporations don't have like individual consciousness or a physical body in the same way that humans do.
Right. So is it just a convenient fiction to say that a corporation is morally responsible, or is there some deeper philosophical truth to it?
It's a big question.
Huge. So this is where Peter French comes in. He's a really important figure in this debate.
Okay.
And his big idea was to shift our focus away from, individual human minds and look instead at the internal structures of corporations.
Interesting.
He said that corporations have these decision-making processes and rules that allow them to act intentionally.
Oh.
So they're like full-fledged moral persons because of that.
So like their internal structure makes them able to act morally.
Kind of, yeah. It was a pretty radical idea at the time.
I can see why.
But of course, it sparked a lot of debate.
Right.
Like, Donaldson argued that corporations can't be persons because they don't have the same capacities as humans. Like, they can't feel happiness or suffering.
That makes sense.
And Velasquez had a different critique. He said that, yeah, corporations act,
Right.
but it's always the individual humans within the company who are ultimately responsible.
So like if a company does something unethical, it's the people who made those decisions who should be held accountable.
Exactly. He's putting the emphasis on individual accountability.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though, because even French himself later revised his view.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he kind of backed away from calling corporations moral persons,
Hmm.
but he still maintained that they were moral agents that could act intentionally.
So that's like a subtle but important distinction, right?
Exactly. And it shows just how complex this question really is.
Yeah, for sure.
But the debate doesn't stop there. Contemporary philosophers like List and Pettit have come up with this really interesting argument based on what they call discursive dilemmas.
Discursive dilemmas.
Yeah, basically they're saying that a corporation's decisions can be different from what any of its individual members would have chosen.
How does that work?
Well, it's kind of like how, in a group discussion, sometimes the final decision isn't something that anyone in the group totally agreed with at first.
Oh, I see, because of how the discussion and voting went.
Exactly. And Liss and Pettit say that this shows how corporations have a kind of independent agency.
So the structure of the decision-making process itself creates a kind of agency that goes beyond the individuals.
Yeah, it's like the whole is greater than the sum of its parts kind of thing.
That's a fascinating perspective.
And it definitely makes it harder to figure out, where exactly moral responsibility lies.
Yeah, for sure. And then there's the whole question of what intention even means in this context.
Right. Some philosophers say that corporations can't really have intentions in the same way that humans do.
Because they're not conscious in the same way.
Right. Like if you think of intention as a specific mental state with beliefs and desires and a conscious plan.
It's hard to see how a corporation could have that.
Yeah. But others have a more functionalist view.
Okay.
They say that intention is more about, rational planning and responding to reasons.
I see.
So if a corporation has procedures for setting goals and acting in a consistent way.
Then it can be said to have intentions in a meaningful sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's Sepinwall's argument, which brings emotion into the mix.
Emotion.
Yeah, she says that to be truly morally responsible, you need to be able to feel emotions like guilt or empathy.
Okay.
And since corporations don't have those capacities, they can't be full moral agents.
That's interesting. So like a corporation might do something that looks like remorse,
Right, like recalling a faulty product.
but it's not really feeling remorse in the same way a human would.
Right, but then you get the functionalist counter-argument again.
Of course.
People like Bjornson and Hess say that corporations might show functional equivalents of emotions in their behavior.
Even if it's not the same as subjective human experience.
Exactly. So it really makes you question what these concepts like intention and emotion even mean when we're talking about something other than an individual.
Yeah, it's like a whole new level of analysis.
Totally. But even if we can't definitively say whether corporations are moral agents, what are the practical implications of all this? Like, how should we treat them?
That's the crucial question, right? Hasnas argues that even if we don't think firms are morally responsible in the same way as people,
Right.
we can still regulate them, require them to compensate for harms, and even condemn their culture if it's unethical.
Right.
We might not blame them the same way we blame a person, but we can still hold them accountable.
I see. So there's a difference between moral blame and other forms of accountability.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that distinction is really important for navigating the ethics of business.
Okay, so let's shift gears now and talk about corporate governance.
Okay.
This is another area with a lot of philosophical tension.
Yeah.
Who should companies be run for and who should be in control?
Yeah, the classic debate is between shareholder primacy and stakeholder theory.
Exactly. Shareholder primacy, which has been the dominant view for a long time,
Right.
says that a company's main ethical and legal obligation is to maximize profits for its shareholders.
Because they're the owners of the company.
Right. And there are philosophical arguments to back that up.
Like what kind of arguments?
Well, some people take a deontological approach.
Okay.
They say that when managers are hired by shareholders, there's an implied promise of fiduciary duty to act in their best financial interests.
So it's like a moral obligation based on that agreement.
Exactly. People like Friedman and Hasnas have made this argument.
I see.
But this whole ownership argument has some problems.
Like what?
Well, as Bainbridge Stout and Spreadler point out, shareholders don't actually own the corporation itself.
Oh, right. They own shares of stock.
Right, which are financial instruments.
So it's not the same as owning a house or a car.
Exactly. And Boatwright even questions whether managers ever actually make this promise to shareholders.
Oh, interesting.
Like, is it really explicit or even implicit? And then there's the consequentialist argument for shareholder primacy,
Okay.
which says that it leads to greater economic efficiency and benefits everyone in the long run.
Because it gives managers one clear objective.
Exactly. Maximize shareholder value. Economists like Hansman and Crackman and Jensen have argued for this.
The efficiency argument is definitely compelling from an economic standpoint.
For sure. But it has its critics, too.
Like who?
Well, Hussein, for example, says that forcing all companies to focus only on shareholder wealth
Yeah.
can limit individual freedom and prevent other valuable economic activities.
So it's like putting all your eggs in one basket.
Right. It raises questions about what the goals of economic activity should be and how much individual choice matters.
That makes sense.
On the other side of the debate, you have stakeholder theory.
Right. Famously associated with Freeman.
Exactly. And stakeholder theory says that managers have to balance the interests of all stakeholders.
So not just shareholders, but employees,
Yeah.
customers, suppliers, the community.
Yeah, anyone who has a stake in the company's actions.
That's a much broader scope.
It is. And the key difference from shareholder primacy is what to do with the leftover profits.
The residual revenues.
Right. Shareholder theory says those profits go to the shareholders.
But stakeholder theory says they should be used to benefit all stakeholders.
Exactly, taking everyone's interests into account.
But that sounds really hard to do in practice.
It can be. One of the main criticisms of stakeholder theory
Yeah.
is that it's difficult to define exactly who counts as a stakeholder.
Right, like where do you draw the line?
Orts and Strudler have pointed that out.
It could get really broad.
It could. And even if you can identify the stakeholders, how do you balance all their competing interests?
Yeah, there's no clear formula for that.
That's been a big challenge for putting stakeholder theory into practice.
I see.
But proponents of stakeholder theory have some responses.
Like what?
Well, there's the instrumental argument, which says that taking care of all stakeholders actually leads to better long-term performance for the company.
So it's good for business in the long run.
Right. And Freeman, along with Evan, has also made an argument based on Rawlsian principles of justice,
Oh, interesting.
saying that it's morally just to consider everyone who's affected by a company's actions.
I see.
It's also worth noting that how people understand stakeholder theory is changing.
In what way?
Well, Norman suggests that it's not necessarily a direct alternative to shareholder primacy,
Okay.
but more like a mindset, a way of approaching business decisions that emphasizes all these different relationships.
So it's not an either situation.
Maybe not. The conflict might not be as absolute as it seems.
That's a good point.
And even in a system that legally prioritizes shareholders,
Right.
having a stakeholder mindset can still encourage managers to think about the broader social and ethical consequences of their decisions.
Yeah, makes sense.
And remember, as Goodpaster and Norman remind us,
Yeah.
this whole debate about the ends of a corporation doesn't mean we can forget about the means.
Right.
Like whether you focus on shareholders or stakeholders, certain actions are just wrong.
Like fraud or mistreating employees?
Exactly. Mishia emphasizes that duties of beneficence still apply.
For sure.
Now let's talk about the means of corporate governance.
Okay.
Who should have control over corporations?
Another big question.
It is. And the arguments often mirror the debates about the ends.
Right. Like if you believe companies should primarily serve shareholders,
Yeah,
then it makes sense that shareholders should also have the control.
exactly. And that's Friedman's argument.
Okay.
He says that shareholders are the owners, so they have the right to control the corporation.
To make sure it's run in their interest.
Right. But like we said earlier, the whole idea of shareholders as owners is debatable.
Yeah. So that weakens Friedman's argument.
It does. So some philosophers and economists have a different view.
What's that?
It's called the contractarian perspective.
Okay.
People like Easterbrook and Fischel and Jensen and Meckling have articulated this.
I mean, what does it say?
Well, they see a corporation as basically a bunch of contracts
Okay.
between different parties like shareholders, employees,
Yeah.
creditor. And from this perspective, the shareholders who provide the capital are the ultimate decision makers.
Because they bear the most risk.
Right. They're the ones who elect the board of directors.
But does that necessarily mean they should have all the control?
Well, that's where the debate gets interesting.
Yeah.
Because thinkers like Anderson have criticized this kind of corporate governance,
Okay.
saying it can be unjust and give too much power to a small group.
So it's like an unaccountable private authority.
Exactly. And this has led to a lot of arguments in favor of more worker participation.
In decision making.
Yeah. Things like giving workers the right to reject arbitrary directives, or
Ugh.
even more extensive models of co-determination where workers have a real say in company policies.
It's like a more democratic workplace.
Right. And some even argue for full worker control over the enterprise.
Wow. That's a big change.
It is. And all these arguments for worker participation have different philosophical justifications.
Like what?
Well, some focus on protecting the interests and well-being of workers.
Okay, that makes sense.
Others emphasize individual autonomy and self-determination.
So extending those principles to the workplace.
Exactly. And then there's the parallel case argument,
Interesting.
which says that if democracy is good for governing a country,
Yeah.
then maybe it's also good for governing companies since they have such a big impact on people's lives.
I can see that.
And Pateman argued that participating in workplace decisions can actually help train people to be better citizens in a democracy.
That's a fascinating idea.
It is. But of course, there are counter-arguments, too.
Like what?
Well, some people say that we should stick to the existing contracts and
Well-
respect the freedom of individuals to structure their economic relationships however they want.
So it's about upholding those agreements.
Right. And then there are concerns about efficiency.
Ah, yeah.
Like, would more worker participation make decision-making slower and less efficient?
And potentially hurt the company's performance.
Exactly. So it's this tension between democratic ideals and economic imperatives.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so we've talked about the who and the for whom of business ethics.
Right.
Now let's talk about the how.
The how.
Yeah, the different philosophical frameworks we can use to analyze ethical problems in business.
Oh, okay. So like different lenses for looking at the same issues.
Exactly. And one really relevant approach is virtue ethics.
Virtue ethics, I remember that from my philosophy classes.
Yeah, it's all about focusing on the character of the people involved in business
Okay.
and the inherent goods that those business practices are trying to achieve.
So it's not just about rules or consequences, but about being a good person in the context of business.
Exactly. It asks what virtues are important for being excellent in your business practices.
Like honesty, integrity, fairness?
Exactly. And it also looks at the specific aims and values of different businesses.
Like what are you actually trying to accomplish?
And how do you need to act in order to achieve those goals in an ethical way?
So it's about the internal goods of business practices.
Right. And some scholars also emphasize the idea of business as a community
Oh,
and how those communities should be structured to help everyone flourish.
I see.
Another major framework is deontology.
I see.
You got it. It emphasizes moral duties and rules.
Oh, okay.
And the idea that you should never treat people as just a means to an end.
Right. They're ends in themselves.
Exactly.
Wow.
And this has big implications for how we view business interactions.
Like how so?
Well, it makes us look for instances of deception, exploitation, manipulation.
Because those are all ways of using people as means to an end.
Right. They violate human dignity and autonomy.
I see.
And then there's Rawlsian justice applied to business ethics.
Interesting.
Rawls himself didn't talk a lot about corporations specifically,
Right.
but other philosophers have explored what his theory of justice as fairness means for the economic sphere.
And what are some of the key takeaways?
Well, it raises questions about power and resources within companies
Okay.
and the need for meaningful work,
Right.
and whether there are alternative models of corporate governance that might be more just.
That's a lot to consider.
It is. And finally, there's the market failures approach.
What's that one about?
Well, it starts by looking at the economic justifications for markets.
Okay.
Like the idea that they can lead to the best outcomes for everyone under perfect competition.
Right.
And then it says that people have an ethical duty to not mess up those conditions.
So like don't cheat or create monopolies or lobby for unfair advantages.
Exactly. Because those things undermine the fairness and efficiency of the market.
That's an interesting way to approach it.
It is. And all these different frameworks show just how rich and complex business ethics is.
Yeah. It's not just about applying a simple set of rules.
Nope. You need to engage with these big ethical theories to really understand what's going on.
It's a whole philosophical world.
It really is.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with something to think about.
Okay.
We've talked about the nature of corporations, their purpose, their responsibilities, and all these different ethical frameworks. So how has all this changed how you view basic philosophical concepts like value fairness or even the good life? Does this world of business, which seems so practical, actually have something to teach us about philosophy's biggest questions?
It's a great question to ponder.
It is. So in this deep dive, we've really explored the ethical landscape of business.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. We talked about corporate moral agency.
Whether companies can be moral actors.
Right. And the debates about corporate governance.
Who controls corporations and what their goals should be.
Exactly. And we looked at how different philosophical frameworks can help us understand ethical dilemmas in business.
It's been a really thought-provoking discussion.
I hope so. Our goal wasn't to give you all the answers,
Right.
but to give you a deeper philosophical understanding of these issues.
And to show how philosophy can be applied to the real world.
Exactly. So keep thinking about these questions and how your philosophical skills can help you navigate the ethical challenges of the business world.
It's an ongoing process.
It is. And as you continue to reflect on all this, think about how even something as seemingly practical as business
Right.
is connected to these fundamental philosophical questions about human action responsibility and how to create a just and flourishing society.
It's all interconnected.
It really is.